Most elements in the Studio editor have some kind of default responsive behavior. You can check out which behaviors are available for each element and set them here in this drop-down menu. And while the size of your elements are represented as pixel values on Canvas, behind the scenes, the Studio editor uses a range of measurements like percentage, viewport width and height, and more to keep your content behaving the way you want. But sometimes you might want to take control of those measurements yourself. The measurement units you choose affect the responsive behavior of your elements on each screen size, so understanding which measurement units achieve which behaviors can be crucial to creating the design you want. So in this lesson, we'll talk through the advanced sizing option, starting with how to turn it on and how to use each of its advanced measurements. You can switch individual components and elements to advanced sizing by clicking the More Actions icon here and switching the toggle on. Or, with the element selected, you can just press Option and I. Just a heads up, you can only switch components back and forth one at a time. You can't turn on advanced sizing for your entire site at once. When you turn on advanced sizing on a component, it'll make the measurement units visible for that component on all breakpoints. All of the default responsive behaviors are built from the units of measurements you can see here. They're CSS properties, so you can change them across breakpoints just like layouts, position, and colors. Now, you can go to any breakpoint and change these to a set of measurements that aren't even covered by a default behavior option. Then, if you then go back to desktop and turn advanced sizing back off, it'll be turned off for that element on every breakpoint. But turning it off won't change your work. Instead, on mobile, where we customize the measurements, you'll see Mixed. Think of it as an inspector panel setting that just shows the editor in a different way. So with this switched off, when you change a responsive behavior on a lower breakpoint, you'll create an override, disconnecting that element's responsive behavior from its properties on higher breakpoints. The same is true when you change its behavior in advanced sizing mode. So when you change the advanced properties to custom properties, you'll see the mixed responsive behavior selected. You can still switch from mixed to a default behavior. But remember, that will override any of your previous changes in advanced sizing with the units of that behavior. For now, we want to reconnect all the behaviors across breakpoints, so we'll right-click the element and click Use on all breakpoints. In advanced sizing, there are a handful of measurement units you can use to tell an element how it should behave, and they each serve a different purpose. Here, for example, you'll see this element is set to fixed, so that no matter what size the screen is, it'll stay the same size. Now, if we switch to advanced sizing, you'll see it still behaves the same way because it was actually set to pixels in both width and height. You might use pixels when you want an element to stay the same size across devices, even when other elements scale up or down. These are standard pixels, as opposed to the pixel on canvas measurements we've discussed before. While elements set with pixels stay exactly the same, other measurements are based on other things, like the width of the parent container, percentage, the viewport height or viewport width, the size of the children, and more. So we can use relative units of measurement to make sure that our designs look perfect on any screen size. That's how the scale proportionally behavior works. So if we apply that here and resize our element, it'll scale in proportion to its parent container. But now let's say you want this image to be 70% of the grid's container's width. You could work it out for yourself in pixels on the canvas, or just switch to advanced sizing. And you'll see here that it's actually just setting this container to percentage width anyway. Percentage units determine an element's size relative to its parent's width or height, or the grid area it's placed in depending on how you've set it up. So rather than calculating 70% in pixels and then entering that in pixels on Canvas, we can just set the width to 70%. Over here in the inspector, You'll see this checkbox for scale proportionally. If this is checked, your width will always be in percentage and the element takes an aspect ratio, so it scales proportionally. If we switch from auto to a different unit, or if we toggle this off, we'll remove the measurement units that created the proportional scaling behavior. If we were to switch both width and height to percentage, the image would retain its size relative to its parent container. The viewport is the size of the area where the site content is shown. When you use viewport width, or VW, or viewport height, VH, your element will scale relative to the viewport's width or height. Viewport units are measured out of 100, so 50 VW means the element will take up half of the viewport width. And elements always take their values from the viewport, independent of their parent. Take this element, for example. Let's set it to 70%. You can see that the button's width now takes up 70% of its parent container's width. But watch what happens when you change this to 70 VW. Now it takes up 70% of the entire viewport's width, ignoring the parent container size. For now, we don't want this overflow, so let's put this button back to 30%. You can set a VW and VH for every element. So if you wanted to, you could have an element take both its width and height from the viewport's width. Now the element will scale proportionally across breakpoints, like this. But for now, let's go back to the previous measurements we had. VH works the same way, but takes the measurements from the viewport's height. Let's say we want to make this section take up the user's entire screen. We can set its height to 100 VH. But if our header is pinned, it'll overlap with that section. To have the section cover the entire viewport height, but start exactly under where the header ends, you can do that by setting the section height to another measurement unit, calc. Calc allows us to set a measurement based on a calculation. To get the effect we want here, we need the section height to be equal to the entire viewport minus the header's height. Clicking on the header, we can see that it's set to 100 pixels. So the section needs to be set to 100 VH minus 100 pixels. So now, you can see that the header and the section together take up the entire height of the screen. And this will still be true, even at different screen sizes. But let's say this logo is getting a bit too small now. We can make sure it stays a good size using minimum and maximum measurements here. So if we set this as the minimum width, the logo will stop scaling once it reaches this size on any screen. But if we scale the screen size up, the logo still scales with it. If you don't want it to be too large, set the max limit so it stops growing at a certain point. Now, let's move on to auto. If an element is set to auto, its height is determined by its children by default. Auto also means that as the container's content gets bigger or smaller, the container changes with it and its height will change according to any margins that we add. We can set a minimum height for the container. If the container has no content inside it to take its height from, it would collapse to 0, but the minimum height prevents that. To make sure the box never gets too large or too small, we can just add minimum and maximum measurements. This way, even if we remove this content from the container, it will never snap to 0 height. And last up, max content just tells a parent element to match the widest or highest point of the content inside. Right now, the text wraps. It doesn't have any line breaks, so basically when we change the container's width to max content, the text will be just one long line and the container will be as wide as the text. So we've covered how to use advanced sizing. Next up, we'll go over how you can turn a section grid into a CSS grid, and some ways you might use CSS grids to take your site to the next level. See you there.